Timothy Murray is a man of integrity, a man who fights for this community. As I stand here before you to introduce this fine gentleman, I can imagine many of the civil rights fighters and freedom fighters of old, like Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, and Nat Turner. I can imagine them gathered in the spirit of the Underground Railroad at the Samuel May House out in Worcester, Massachusetts. I can see them smiling down this morning, looking at this man, Tim Murray, saying, he will fight for you because he cares for you. Then I can think of people like John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy and the late Senator Ted Kennedy, who helped build and who stand on the foundation that elected the first African-American president in Barack Obama, smiling down on this audience today, looking at Tim Murray saying, he will fight for you. And then I can think of none other than Dr. Martin Luther King himself and Rosa Parks, standing on top of the world, gazing across the 7 seas, looking at Tim Murray on this day, on this celebration, to say that Tim Murray will fight for you. He fought for you for education. He fights against domestic violence. He fights for our veterans. He fights for Central Massachusetts. He fights for the citizens of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Ladies and gentlemen, stand to your feet and welcome the Lieutenant Governor, Timothy P. Murray.
Thank you, President Johnson. Thank you, President Johnson. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, President. Might have been a stretch, but it was good. Thank you, President Johnson, for those kind words, but more importantly, for the dynamic, substantive leadership that you've brought to Becker College and to this community in the short period. Yes, we can clap for that. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is now an icon of our shared history. And through events like this breakfast, we see tangible evidence of how his legacy lives on in our lives. Just looking around this room is evidence of that. We come from different religions, different cultures, and heritages, yet we are here today united by an overarching civil faith in freedom, tolerance, and respect. It is moments like this that define who we are as a community and give us pause from the hectic pace of our daily lives to remember what is truly important. Dr. King was a visionary, an inspirational leader, a truth teller, and a patriot. His hope for America was woven in the fabric of our democracy. And in preparing for this morning's breakfast, thinking over the last few weeks what I would share or reflect on Dr. King, I was channel surfing. And I think a number of you probably have seen now some of the commercials promoting a movie that is coming out in February called Red Tails, a story about the Tuskegee Airmen. And it jogged a memory of mine back in 2007. And I was drawn back to 2007 when I met James McLaurin. So I want to share with you that story and his story and our story. James McLaurin was born in Virginia in 1923. He moved to Boston as a young boy when his family joined the migration of African Americans who left the South and headed north and west in search of better lives and economic opportunity. Massachusetts became James's home for the rest of his life. He graduated from Boston's Commerce High School and then Boston Trade School and went to work as a machinist. James was 18 when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and soon thereafter he enlisted in the Army. There was no Air Force at the time, it was the Army Air Corps. At that time, the U.S. military was not colorblind. Men like James, who volunteered to serve, who were willing to put their lives on the line to protect our country, their country, faced the indignities of discrimination and segregation. The decision to enlist, however, would change James' life forever. Because of his intelligence, his skills as a machinist, and his love of airplanes, James got a new opportunity. He was assigned to the Army Air Corps and was sent to Tuskegee, Alabama. He was trained as an aviator and an aeronautical engineer and became one of the legendary Tuskegee Airmen. 996 African-American pilots who fought with courage and distinction abroad, and who eventually became an inspiration for decades of historic social change here at home. The courage and successes of the Tuskegee Airmen, juxtaposed with the cruel ignorance of segregation, helped bring widespread attention to the need for true civil rights for all Americans. The Tuskegee Airmen's example was not lost on a president, Harry Truman, who is often called, and rightly so, our first civil rights president, because he took the unilateral act by executive order to desegregate the United States military in 1948. That institution, putting that institution well ahead of civilian society on the road to true equality for all people. And one of those factors in his decision was the actions of the Tuskegee Airmen. After the war, James served in the reserves for 10 years as an engineering officer assigned to the 100th Fighter Wing at Otis Air Force Base in Cape Cod. He retired with the rank of lieutenant colonel. Raising a family on the South Shore with his wife Helen, James had a successful career in civilian life. He worked as a Marine engineer for the United States Navy, rising to a supervisory level. And after working for the Navy, he became a regional director for the Small Business Administration. According to his family, like so many World War II veterans, he didn't speak much about his time of service during the war. Instead, he chose to focus his time and energy on his family, his work, and giving back to his community. In 2006, the United States Congress passed legislation to honor the Tuskegee Airmen with a Congressional Gold Medal in recognition of their groundbreaking achievements. For many, it was a posthumous honor, but not for James. On November 11, 2007, James McLaurin and 4 other surviving Tuskegee Airmen from Massachusetts were invited to the State House to receive those congressional medals from Governor Patrick. I stood at the governor's side and held the medals as we approached the airmen who were seated in the front row of the audience for the presentation. When we came to Mr. McLaurin, he stood up out of his chair to receive the medal. And just before Governor Patrick presented him, Mr. McLaurin leaned forward and said this quietly to Governor Patrick: "Seeing you as governor, now I can die in peace." Governor Patrick was speechless, emotion welling in his eyes. I felt a knot in my throat as I do now. The power of the moment was inescapable. Here was a man who had volunteered to fight for his country, a country that held out a promise of freedom, but did not deliver on that promise for people of color during much of his life. He was a man who, like countless thousands of African Americans, had sacrificed in war because they hoped, as Dr. King so eloquently said, that the United States of America would eventually rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. On that day in 2007, at 84 years of age, James McLaurin looked into the eyes of the first African American elected as governor of his home state, and he knew that his faith in America was not misplaced, that the people had chosen that man as governor based upon the content of his character rather than the color of his skin. In Hebrews, it says in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, that faith is the substance of all things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. He kept faith. His faith gave him hope that the promise of America could overcome the racism that he had witnessed in the military, in the Jim Crow South, when he saw Rosa Parks, when he saw Little Rock, when he saw the Freedom Riders, when he saw the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church and 4 young people, children, women killed. He had moments of doubt and despair, there's no doubt James McLaurin did, but he had that faith and that hope that we would reach a better place. And he realized that his sacrifice and that of his comrades, especially those that had been killed, had not been done in vain, that America, through the commitment of, through lots of good people, would realize that vision that he and Dr. King and that those comrades that he fought alongside had for this country, a love of this country. James McLaurin died on May 18th, 2010. By then, he'd also been to the White House to be honored by President Obama, and yet another stunning example of how far our country had come on its quest to live out that creed. Dr. King is well known and revered for his belief in nonviolent protest. And even though he spoke out forcefully against the Vietnam War, not just for issues of race, but for issues of class, he believed, Dr. King, that serving in the United States military was honorable service. It is honorable for all Americans because our creed, our faith, our belief is worth defending. And Dr. King saw military service as especially empowering for African Americans and other minorities, because the military allowed them to grow and succeed on their merits, not hobbled by discrimination that still permeated too much of civilian society. As Lieutenant Governor, one of the most satisfying parts of the job is to chair the Governor's Advisory Council on Veteran Services, where we work to make sure that all veterans in Massachusetts and their families get the services and support that they have earned access to. It's especially important for us to have this conversation now, as a whole new generation of veterans return from Iraq and Afghanistan. They don't, in many instances, return home to bases. They return home to our neighborhoods and streets, given the unprecedented reliance on our Guard and Reserve. These veterans, they, perhaps more than any other war or conflict, we see more women, more minorities reflecting the diversity of our society. Over the past few years, as we dealt with the deepest economic challenges of our lives, we need to make sure that we're doing all we can to support these veterans and their families and plug them in to our communities. For the returning veterans, some face challenges because of the combat experiences and experience of war, and we need to make sure that we are aware of them and understand them and support them. And we need to make sure that we have the resources there to do that. In the preamble of the Massachusetts Constitution, John Adams wrote that we live in, quote, a social compact by which the whole people covenants with each citizen, and each citizen with the whole people, that all shall be governed for the common good. And there's our veterans who make sure that we can share and be a part of that common good. That ideal is an unbroken thread that runs through our history, and it was reinforced by Dr. King, who told us that, and I quote, all life is interrelated. Somehow we're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. You can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. I hope we will never forget how connected we truly are, and that when we leave this breakfast and get back to our daily routines, that we will each do our part to advance the ideals of fairness, freedom, and democracy that Dr. King lived and died for, and that James McLaurin and the Tuskegee Airmen fought for as well. Thank you.